I sold the farm equipment business my husband and I built for 31 years, and I told my daughter I'd gotten a fair price for it. I did not tell her the number. 3 weeks later, over Thanksgiving dinner in her dining room in Mississauga, she asked me, in front of everyone, when I was going to stop being a burden and figure out my living situation. I set down my fork. The next morning, I called a lawyer in Toronto and quietly bought the lake house her husband had been showing off photos of for 2 years. Not for them. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for being here with me again. It's Helen. Pour yourself something warm and stay a while, and please, if you would, tell me in the comments which town or city you're listening from. I always like to know how far these stories travel. This one is mine, and I want to tell it properly from the start, because the beginning is where you can see all the small cracks that nobody pays attention to until the whole thing gives way. My name is Ruth Caldwell. I was 68 years old the night my daughter told the table full of people that I had become a problem to be managed. I'd been living in her house in Mississauga for 14 months by then, ever since my husband Walter died the way he'd lived, quietly and without making a fuss, in the hospital in Saskatoon after his second heart attack. We'd been married 43 years. We raised our 2 kids on a half section outside of Rosthern, Saskatchewan, where Walter ran a small business selling and repairing farm equipment, and I kept the books and answered the phone and made the coffee for every farmer who came through that door looking for a part or a bit of conversation in the off-season. When Walter passed, my daughter Colleen flew out for the funeral, and she was kind that week. I'll give her that. She held my hand at the graveside. She organized the lunch afterward at the community hall. The egg salad sandwiches and the squares, the urns of weak coffee. And on the third day, standing in my kitchen with the frost on the windows, she said, "Mom, you can't stay out here by yourself. It's not safe. Come to Ontario, come live with us." And I looked around at the linoleum Walter and I had put down ourselves in 1987, and the calendar from the co-op still turned to the wrong month, and I said yes. I should have asked her what she meant by live with us. I should have asked a great many things, but grief makes you agreeable in a way that costs you later. Colleen's house was big. Her husband, Brent, did well in commercial insurance, and they'd bought into one of those subdivisions where every house has a double garage and a lawn the same shade of green, and a name on the development sign that means nothing. Maple Glen Estates or some such. They gave me the bedroom over the garage. It was a nice enough room. It had its own little 3-piece bathroom and a window that looked out at the side of the neighbor's house, close enough that I could hear their dryer running. I was told, gently, by Colleen, that the thermostat downstairs was set on a schedule and I shouldn't touch it, and that the front entryway closet was full, so my winter boots could go in the mudroom by the garage door. I told myself it was an adjustment. Everybody needs time to settle, I said to myself. Colleen worked at a dental office doing the administration. Brent traveled for work 3 days most weeks. Their kids, Tyler, who was 16 and built like a hockey player and just as talkative as a fence post, and Jasmine, who was 12 and lived inside her phone, treated me like a piece of furniture that occasionally spoke. So I made myself useful, the way my mother taught me, the way you do. I cooked supper most nights. I packed the kids' lunches. I did the laundry and learned the complicated settings on a machine that cost more than my first car. I drove Jasmine to her dance and Tyler to the rink at 6 in the morning when the ice time was cheap. I shoveled the walk. I kept quiet. What I never said out loud was how small I'd started to feel. It comes on slow, that feeling, like the way the days get shorter in October. You don't notice it happening. You just look up one afternoon and realize it's dark already and you can't remember the last time it was light. There was the evening Colleen had her girlfriends over for wine and introduced me as Brent's mother-in-law. She's been staying with us, as though I were a house guest who'd forgotten the date of her return flight. I am not Brent's mother-in-law. I am Colleen's mother. There was the long weekend in February. They all drove up to Blue Mountain to ski and didn't mention it to me until I came down Saturday morning to an empty house and a note on the island that said, "Gone skiing, back Monday. Help yourself to whatever." And there was the conversation I overheard in March, the one I think about more than I'd like to admit, when I was coming up the stairs and heard Colleen's voice through their bedroom door, low and tired. "She's here all the time, Brent. The grocery bill's gone up, the hydro's gone up, and she's just always there." I stood on that landing with my hand on the railing for what felt like a long time. Then I went up to my room over the garage and shut the door without a sound. I want to be fair, because fairness matters to me, and I'll need you to trust that later. I was not an easy person to have around, perhaps. I am set in my ways. I like the radio on in the kitchen. I keep odd hours. I have opinions about how a roast should be done, and I'm not shy with them. I asked myself, lying awake in that room with the dryer humming through the wall, whether I was too much, whether I let myself become the kind of old woman who takes up space and gives nothing back. I thought about Walter every single night, about our bed in Saskatchewan and the way he'd warm his cold feet against mine in the winter and laugh when I yelped, about how he used to say, "Ruthie, you worry like it's a paying job." I thought about everything I'd handed over to come and be tolerated in a room above a garage. But I stayed because Colleen was my daughter, and because I believed, the way my generation was taught to believe, that family is family, and you don't quit on it. The thing that changed everything didn't feel like anything at all when it happened. Walter and I had been talking in the last couple of years before he died about selling the business. He was tired, his knees were gone. Neither of the kids wanted it. Colleen had her life in Ontario, and our son Dean was working the rigs up north and had no interest in selling tractor parts in a town of 2,000 people. So we'd had the conversation, quietly, the way we did everything, and then Walter died before we could do anything about it. For a year I let it sit. The shop was locked up, the inventory gathering dust, and I paid the property tax out of habit and didn't think too hard about it. Then a fellow named Gus Penner, who'd run a bigger equipment dealership over in Warman, reached out through Walter's old business partner. He wanted to buy us out. The land, the building, the dealership agreements, the parts inventory, the goodwill, all of it. Walter and I had owned that property outright since 1994, and we'd bought the 2 adjoining lots when the hardware store next door went under in the recession. And over the years, that little corner of Rosthern had quietly become worth a great deal more than 2 people who never thought of themselves as anything but workers ever imagined. There was the dealership contract too, which Gus wanted badly, and a non-compete he was willing to pay handsomely for. I'll tell you the number, because there's no point telling this story if I'm going to be coy about the one fact the whole thing turns on. When it was all said and done, after the lawyers and the accountants and the capital gains, I walked away with a little over $4 million. $4 million. I found out the deal had closed on a Tuesday morning, sitting at Colleen's kitchen island with my reading glasses and a cup of the coffee from the machine that I never did learn to work properly. My accountant in Saskatoon called me. He read me the final figure twice because I asked him to. Then I thanked him and hung up and sat very still, looking out the patio doors at the snow on Colleen's back deck and the barbecue under its gray cover. And I did not make a single sound. I had not told anyone in that house that the business was even for sale. I want you to understand that, not because I was scheming, not at first. I simply didn't think it was any of their concern. Walter's life's work, my life's work. My life's work. It belonged to me. I folded the printout the accountant emailed and slid it into my Bible, between the pages of Ecclesiastes, and I said nothing. That was the 3rd week of October. Thanksgiving in Canada, of course, is the 2nd Monday of October. So we'd already had ours, and I should have known better than to think a family meal was a safe place. But this wasn't even a holiday. This was just a Sunday supper a couple of weeks later. the kind we had every week. Brent's parents had driven in from Burlington. Colleen had made a turkey because she'd bought too big a bird for Thanksgiving and frozen half of it. There were the kids, eyes down on their phones, and Brent's mother and father, perfectly pleasant people, and Brent at the head of the table, carving and telling a long story about a deal at work that nobody followed. I was passing the dish of mashed turnip when Colleen said it. She didn't look at me when she said it. That's the part that stays with me. She was scraping gravy off the edge of the boat with a spoon, looking at the gravy. And she said, in this light, almost joking voice that wasn't joking at all, "We really need to figure out Mom's living situation. I love you, Mom, but you can't just be a burden up in that room forever. We need a plan." And Brent's mother gave a little laugh, the uncomfortable kind, and Brent said something like, "Colleen, come on," but weakly, the way you object to something you actually agree with. The table went quiet. Tyler glanced up from his phone. Jasmine stopped chewing. I looked at my daughter, at the spoon in her hand, and the gravy and the part in her hair that I used to comb when she was small and feverish and couldn't sleep, and something in me that had been holding very tight for 14 months simply let go. I set down the dish of turnip. I folded my napkin and laid it beside my plate. I pushed back my chair and I stood up. "Excuse me," I said very pleasantly, and I left the table. I didn't go up to my room. I went out the back, into the cold, in just my cardigan, and I stood on that deck under the gray barbecue cover and looked up at the sky going dark over the rooftops of Maple Glen Estates, all identical, not one of them mine, and I let myself feel the whole weight of it for the first time. The room above the garage, the thermostat I wasn't to touch, Brent's mother-in-law, the note on the island, the grocery bill, and now my own daughter calling me a burden over a turkey dinner with the gravy still steaming, and a plan. She wanted a plan, as though I were a problem on a spreadsheet that had gone on too long. I was not a woman who cried easily. Walter used to say I had a face like the prairie sky in January. You always knew what kind of weather was coming, but it never warmed you up much. He meant it kindly. But out on that deck I let it come, just for a few minutes, and then I wiped my face on my sleeve, the way I had at every funeral and every hospital and every hard thing in my life, and I started to think, where would I go? That was the practical question, and it frightened me more than I'd admit to anyone. My house in Saskatchewan, the real one, the one Walter and I lived in, I'd sold it 8 months after I moved east. Colleen had pushed for that too. "Mom, it's just sitting empty. The pipes will freeze. You're paying to heat a house nobody's in." She'd been right, in the cold, practical way. She was always right about things that cost me something I couldn't put a price on. I cried for a week after that closing, and Colleen had said I was being emotional. So I had nowhere. A room over a garage in a town where I knew no one, and a husband under the snow, 1,800 kilometers west. And then I thought of the number. $4 million sitting quietly in accounts that not one soul in that house knew existed. I stood on the deck until I couldn't feel my hands, and by the time I came back inside the kitchen, was cleared and everyone had scattered to their corners of that big house, and nobody, not one of them, had come out to ask if I was all right. No knock on the patio door. No, Mom. Just the dishwasher running and the television going in the den. The silence told me more than the words at dinner had. I lay awake in the room over the garage until past 2 in the morning, and I did the most important thinking I have ever done in my life. The fear came first, and I'll be honest about that, because anyone who tells you they weren't afraid in a moment like that is lying or doesn't remember it right. I was 68 and alone and about to do something I couldn't undo. But then I thought of Walter and a thing he used to say. He'd grown up with nothing, the youngest of 7 on a hardscrabble farm near Hague, and he'd watched his own parents get talked down and taken advantage of their whole lives because they were too polite and too tired to stand up for themselves. "Ruthie," he'd say, "being scared is fine. Just don't let it sign your name to anything." So I thought about the evidence, not the excuses I'd been making. Not she's stressed and Brent travels so much, and the kids are a handful. The actual facts. My daughter discussing the cost of feeding me through a closed bedroom door. My daughter calling me a burden over Sunday supper without so much as looking up from the gravy. And every one of them watching me leave that table and choosing the dishwasher over their own mother. Then I thought about what they would do if they knew about the $4 million. And that thought came to me cold and clear as well. Water, and it settled everything. They could not know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. It would depend entirely on what happened next. I got the notepad from the drawer of the nightstand and I made a list, the way I'd made lists my whole life, grocery lists and parts orders and the order of service for Walter's funeral. I wrote, 1. Say nothing to anyone in this house, not a word about the sale. 2. Get my own lawyer and my own financial advisor before anyone knows I have anything to manage. 3. Set myself up completely separate from Colleen, my own bank, my own everything. 4. Find a home. A real one. Mine. I looked at that list a long while. It looked like something a harder woman than me would write. Then I thought again of the dish of turnip in my hands when my daughter called me a burden, and I underlined the 4th item twice, hard enough to tear the paper a little. I'd built a home once and spent 43 years in it. I'd spent 14 months letting myself believe I didn't deserve another. That was finished. The next morning I was up before 6. I showered and put on the good navy slacks and the blouse I kept for church, and I went down to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea before anyone stirred. I sat at the island with Colleen's tablet, which she left charging on the counter, and I looked up estate and trust lawyers in Toronto who handled the phrase I learned that morning, high net worth privacy planning. By the time Colleen came down at 7:30 in her work clothes, I'd written 3 names on the back of a grocery receipt and tucked it into my cardigan pocket. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at me, dressed and tidy and drinking tea at the island, and I think it surprised her. "You're up early," she said. "I am," I said. And I smiled at her, and I did not tell her one single thing. The lawyer I chose was a woman named Priya Sandhu, who ran a small practice up near Yonge and Eglinton, and who, when I called, had an assistant who took my information with the kind of discretion you can hear in a voice. I told Colleen I had a doctor's appointment downtown and I took the GO train in by myself, which I had never once done, and I sat by the window watching the backs of all those houses go by and felt, for the first time in over a year, like a person was somewhere to be. Priya was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, kind, but no nonsense, and she did not blink when I told her the figure. She'd seen bigger, I imagine, in that part of the city. What she did was lean forward and ask me what I wanted, and when I started to talk about Colleen and the room over the garage and the burden and the plan they wanted, she stopped me, gently, and said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm not asking what they did. I'm asking what you want." And I sat there in that quiet office with the good carpet and I realized no one had asked me that, not once, since Walter died. I told her I wanted to be invisible to my family, financially. I wanted my own accounts, my own home, everything kept clean and separate. I wanted to know that no one could touch what Walter and I had earned, no matter what happened. And I wanted to know what my options were for an old woman who had a great deal of money and a family she could no longer entirely trust. Priya walked me through it over the next 2 hours and several appointments after, the way you'd explain a thing patiently to someone who's smart but new to it. We'd set up a trust. We'd keep my principal protected. She brought in a financial advisor named Marcus, a steady fellow about my son's age, and the 2 of them built me a structure I won't bore you with, except to say that when it was done, my money was mine, behind a wall, and no amount of upset from anyone in Mississauga could get a finger on it. And then, because I'd been carrying it around since that night on the deck, I told Priya about the lake house. Brent had been talking for 2 years about a place up in Muskoka. Not their place, a place he wanted, a property on Lake Roseau that belonged to an older couple who'd been hinting they might sell. He'd shown the photos around at every dinner. The dock, the boathouse, the screened porch over the water, the way some men show photos of a car they can't afford. "That's the dream right there," he'd say. "Couple more good years and we make a move on something like that." Colleen would smile, that tight smile she had when Brent talked about money. I'd sat through it a dozen times, the mother-in-law in the corner holding the salad. I had Marcus look into it quietly. The couple did want to sell, it turned out, and they wanted to sell privately. No sign on the lawn, no agent, because they were old and didn't want the fuss. Marcus put me in touch through a lawyer up in Bracebridge. I drove up to see it on a cold, bright day in early November. The lake already skimmed with ice at the edges, and I walked through that house, the screened porch, the stone fireplace, the big east-facing windows over the water, and I knew it wasn't a spite purchase, whatever it might look like. I want to be clear about that because I've turned it over enough times to be sure of it. I didn't buy it to take it from Brent. I bought it because I walked into that bright, cold house over the water, and for the first time since Walter died, I felt the thing I used to feel in my kitchen in Saskatchewan, which is the feeling of being somewhere that is yours. The fact that it was the very place Brent had wanted. Well, life has a sense of humor, and so, I've learned, do I. I closed on it the third week of November. I told no one. I had movers bring up the few things I'd kept in storage from Saskatchewan that I couldn't part with. Walter's old armchair, my mother's china, the quilt my grandmother made, and I bought what else I needed up there fresh. And then, when it was done, when I had a home and a lawyer and a trust and my own 2 feet under me again, I decided it was time to have the conversation. I asked Colleen if I could take the family for lunch the Sunday after. My treat. Somewhere nice. She was suspicious, I could tell, but she agreed, and she chose an expensive place in Oakville, testing me a little, I think, seeing if I'd balk at the prices. I did not balk. Brent's parents came again. The kids came, sullen at being made to wear collared shirts. We ordered and made small talk, and when the plates were cleared, I set my folder on the table. I'd asked Priya how to do it, and she'd said, "Say less than you think you need to. The facts do the work." So I did. I told them calmly that I'd sold Walter's business, that it had done better than anyone expected, that I'd bought myself a home and set up my affairs with a lawyer and an advisor, and that I would be moving out of the room over the garage that week. Colleen's face did something complicated. "You when? Mom, where? Why didn't you say anything? How much did you—" And she caught herself, but we all heard the shape of the question she'd started to ask. "It's taken care of," I said. "You don't need to worry about my living situation anymore. I know how much that was weighing on you." I let that sit for a moment, and I watched it land. The gravy and the spoon and the burden, all of it, in her eyes. Brent leaned in and asked, in a careful voice, where the new place was. And I told him it was on Lake Roseau. I watched his face. I am not proud of how good that moment felt, but I won't pretend it didn't feel like something. "Lake Roseau," he said. "Whereabouts on Roseau?" And I gave him the name of the road, and I saw him understand. The color went out of his face the way it goes out of the sky, right before the streetlights come on. "That's the Hendersons' place," he said quietly. "It was," I said. "It's mine now." Nobody said anything for a moment. Colleen's mother-in-law looked at her plate. Then Colleen, my daughter, said, "Mom, you're being vindictive, after everything we did for you." And there it was, the word "did," as though I'd been a charity case they'd taken in out of the goodness of their hearts, as though I hadn't cooked and cleaned and shoveled and driven and held my tongue for 14 months in a room I wasn't allowed to make my own. "I don't think I'm being vindictive," I said. "I think I'm being clear. There's a difference." I gathered my folder. "I love you, Colleen. I will always love you. But I am done arranging my life around the comfort of people who decided I was a burden." When you'd like to talk to me as your mother and not as a problem you're managing, you know where I am. I'm on Lake Rousseau. And I said a warm goodbye to Brent's parents, who'd never been anything but decent to me, and to the kids, and I picked up the bill on the way out, and I drove myself home. I want to tell you the part that comes after, because I think it's the part that matters, and it's the part the storybook version always leaves out. It was not a clean triumph. There's no such thing, I found. Priya called me the following Monday to tell me Colleen had phoned her office, fishing, wanting to know if I was of sound mind and whether I'd been taken advantage of. Priya told her, politely, that I was entirely competent and represented by counsel, and that there was nothing to discuss. And that was the end of that. There was nothing for Colleen to challenge. The trust held. The law in Ontario does not require a mother to explain herself to her grown children, nor to leave them a single dollar if she chooses not to. Priya did tell me, the way a good lawyer will, that I could cut Colleen out entirely if I wanted. I sat with that for an evening, in Walter's armchair, looking out at the dark lake. I didn't want to punish my daughter. I wanted to be fair, which is a different and harder thing. So when Priya and I finished the will, it read like this: 40% to my son Dean, who'd called me every single Sunday from up north for 14 months, who never once asked about money, only ever asked if I was eating and whether I was warm enough. 20% to Colleen, enough to matter, not enough to reward what had happened, and 40% to a foundation that funds rural literacy and libraries in small prairie towns, because Walter learned to read late and badly, and it shamed him his whole life, and he'd have wanted that more than anything I could think of. The grandchildren I set up education funds for, separately and directly, because they were children, and none of this was their doing. Brent was not mentioned anywhere. He had no claim, and the marriage, as it turned out, didn't last the year. Because here is the other thing that happened, and I take no joy in it. Colleen and Brent separated the following summer. I won't pretend the money had nothing to do with it. Money has a way of showing you what was already cracked. But I didn't cause it any more than the frost causes the pothole. The water was already in the seam. I only happened to be there when it finally broke open. Dean flew down to see the lake house in the spring. He walked through it slow, the way Walter used to walk a piece of equipment he was thinking of buying. Touching things, not saying much, and at the end he stood out on the dock and looked at the water for a long time and said, "Dad would have loved this, Mom." And I said, "He would have been unbearable about being right, you mean?" Because Walter always did say I should have let him build a place on a lake, and Dean laughed, and it was the first time I'd heard either of us laugh in a long while. My grandchildren came in July. It took some dilling and some careful talking through Colleen, who I never stopped speaking to, but who I no longer let speak to me as though I were a burden. Jasmine, 12 and glued to her phone, put it down the second she saw the dock and spent 3 days in the lake. Tyler, who I'd have sworn couldn't put 2 sentences together, found a book on my shelf about the building of the Great Canadian Railways and asked me actual questions about it. And I saw Walter in him, and his great-grandfather, and the long line of stubborn, quiet people I come from. There's a man up the road named Gordon. No, I'll not put it that way. There's a neighbor, a widower, a retired schoolteacher who keeps bees and grows the best tomatoes on the lake and brought me a jar of honey the first week I moved in. We've taken to having coffee on the porch Saturday mornings. He's good company in the quiet way I've come to prefer. I am not looking for another Walter. There isn't one. But I've learned that a life doesn't have to be lonely just because it's solitary. Colleen and I talk now, on the phone every couple of weeks. It's careful. We are both learning how to speak to each other without the old machinery of who owes what running underneath every word. She apologized, eventually, on the phone one night in February. A real apology. The specific kind, not the "I'm sorry you feel that way" kind. She said she'd let herself see me as a problem, because it was easier than seeing me as her mother, who was grieving, who'd given up everything to come east on 3 days' notice in the middle of her own worst loss. I told her I forgave her, which was true, and that forgiving her did not mean moving back into the room over the garage, which was also true. She understood. It's a beginning. That's all most things ever are. People ask me sometimes, my neighbor with the bees asks in his roundabout way, whether I have regrets, whether I'd do it differently. And I don't, not really. The only thing I'd change is the 14 months I spent shrinking myself to fit a room above a garage, telling myself that being tolerated was the same as being loved. I knew the difference. I'd known it my whole life. I just forgot it for a while in my grief, and it took my own daughter calling me a burden over a dish of turnip to remind me I had $4 million. But that's not the thing that changed my life, and I want you especially to hear that part. The money only gave me choices. The thing that actually changed everything happened in the half second I set down that turnip and folded my napkin and stood up from the table. The money was just the road. Standing up was the leaving. So if there's someone in your life who has made you feel like you're in the way, like you're a problem to be solved, like the love comes with an invoice attached, I want you to hear an old woman from the prairies tell you this. You are not too old, and it is not too late. And you do not have to wait for $4 million to stand up from the table. The standing up is free. It always was. What would you have done, sitting there with the turnip in your hands? I'd truly like to know. Tell me in the comments and tell me where you're listening from, and if this story meant something to you, pass it along to someone who might need to hear it tonight. Thank you for sitting with me. It means more than you know. I've gone over that supper 100 times since. The dish of turnip in my hands, the gravy on Colleen's spoon, and what I keep coming back to is that none of it was sudden. Things that look sudden almost never are. 14 months of small silences and closed doors and a thermostat I wasn't to touch had to add up to something. The same way water gets into a crack and freezes and thaws, until one spring the whole road gives way. My daughter calling me a burden wasn't the cause of anything. It was just the morning I finally heard the ice break. What I've learned, sitting in Walter's old armchair looking out at the lake he'd have loved, is that the money was never the point, and I worry sometimes that people watching will think it was. $4 million only handed me choices. It didn't hand me the spine to stand up from that table, and it certainly didn't hand me the sense to do it carefully. Those I had to find on my own, late at night with a notepad, frightened half to death. I think there are 3 things that carried me through, and not one of them came from the bank. The first is that I tried, even when I was hurt worse than I'd been hurt in years, to do the decent thing instead of the cruel one. I could have cut Colleen out entirely. Priya told me I had every right, but I gave my son Dean the larger share because he'd earned it with 14 months of Sunday phone calls that never once mentioned money. And I left Colleen enough to matter because she's still my girl. And a person who lets bitterness write her will ends up poorer than she started, no matter what the number says. Fairness is harder than revenge. It's also the only thing you can live inside of afterward. The second is that I stopped letting other people do my thinking for me. For 14 months I'd accepted Colleen's version of what was sensible. Sell the house, don't be emotional, be grateful. The day I sat in Priya's office and someone finally asked me what I wanted, I realized I'd handed my judgment away the way you hand over a coat at the door. Taking it back, learning the trust and the structure and the slow, careful steps, that was the real work. Not the winning. The understanding. And the third is plain stubbornness, the prairie kind, the kind that gets up at 6 in a room over a garage and puts on the good Navy slacks and books the lawyer anyway. Walter used to say being scared was fine, just don't let it sign your name to anything. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the next right thing with your hands shaking. So if you take anything from an old woman on a cold lake, let it be this. Be fair even when you're owed cruelty. Keep your own counsel, and stand up shaking or not. The standing up was always free.